Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. So, hope everyone has had a good weekend. It is Monday at about 8:33. So, yeah, I had mentioned I did a video recently on the fact that I spent a well, pretty big amount of money on Saturday during the hurricane. I went to Opera House Video, the only and my favorite video shop that I'm aware of in Maine that still exists, where you can go and rent movies. Um, and they have a great selection, but they've been doing these big sales. They did one in June of this past summer, and then they just had one this past weekend, and they're doing one in another a few months again. Basically, they're doing these big sales of all of their like inventory. They have multiple copies of all of these films, so it's pretty exciting. They're selling all kinds of DVDs and a pretty good amount of Blu-rays. So I bought a shit ton of movies on Saturday. I went there in the morning. It was kind of an early opening. They started at about 11:15 and I got there early. I was the first one there. So I bought a shit ton of movies. So I've been slowly watching those. I started watching those films that I bought last night. So I'm doing a whole series on each of those films. I'm going to be doing a series of those films, even if I or reviews of each of the movies, even if they weren't particularly a great experience for me. A lot of the movies I bought, I don't know, it's pretty even, pretty divided, I guess. There's a lot of titles that I have seen, and then there was a lot of movies I haven't seen, so it was pretty cool balance. Most of the movies that I bought were DVDs. I still buy DVDs. I try to focus, well, being a fan, film fanatic, but then also being a collector. I try to focus on mostly Blu-rays. Blu-rays are the way to go. I'm considering maybe doing, eventually getting a 4K TV. I have seen a few movies on 4K, and it is pretty amazing to say the least. But I'm really happy with Blu-ray quality. It's just superior. I I did get a pretty good amount, a handful of some Blu-rays and then also that during that same day, because the power was out, and there was you know not too many things you could do. I was just kind of hanging out, and I went to the store. I got some candles and shit, and I was prepared that the power was going to be knocked out for a long time. So then after I got home from the sale and doing a couple of things, the power had been out for maybe 2 3 hours at that point. My parents called me and they said, "Hey, do you want to go out for Chinese food in Bangor?" And I was like, "Sure, let's do it." So literally within a half hour, we got in the car and we went to Bangor and went out to this Chinese buffet. But since it was in Bangor, we went to Bull Moose. I went to Bull Moose that day too, and I bought another haul of movies. And so when I go to Bull Moose, I always try to focus on buying Blu-ray. And usually, if I'm at Goodwill, I go to the Goodwill in Rockland, Maine, and that's usually where I'll buy DVDs. But I'll buy, I'll try to pick up anything that's of interest or anything that I like, or maybe things that I haven't seen because they're really really cheap. Blu-rays, so. But when I go to Bull Moose, I try to buy all of the horror exploitation movies because that style is my favorite. So it was great. So I came away from Saturday with completely insane amount of movies. It was kind of ridiculous. And and by the time we got home, which was like, we were gone. I was gone most of the day yesterday, Saturday. So by the time I came home was like probably like 7 o'clock in the evening, and I had been trying to keep busy or whatever since the power was out, and we were up in Bangor for quite a while. The power had come back on about 5 o'clock, so it was pretty cool. So then I came home and started watching the movies. So pretty sweet, pretty excited. So today's show is going to be on a movie which is, you know, a movie that, what else can you say about it? Everything that I feel that's been discussed about it, it's been talked about. It's always looked at as a slasher classic, which it is. And there's a whole funny story behind it. But I finally just picked up John Carpenter's 1978 slasher classic Halloween on Blu-ray. Now, this might seem completely ridiculous. This is the 35th anniversary edition, and it's a beautiful package. And it's so crazy because this is, obviously probably the most popular like slasher movie of all time outside of like Friday the 13th, but I almost feel that this movie might be even more popular than that franchise. The franchise as a whole, the Halloween franchise is huge, is bigger than ever. And it's mostly attributed to, the last three films that came out that were directed by David Allen Green, which I don't know. I honestly have a lot of mixed feelings about that. But as a whole, I would say it's safe to say that the Halloween franchise is probably commercially the biggest kind of slasher franchise in the world. And I would say that this film here, Halloween 1978, is easily probably the most well known, most talked about, most well respected slasher movie of all time. This movie was a landmark. There are there's one guy I like a lot on YouTube who does a really great show, and he really covers extensively, goes really into the whole like horror exploitation world. He does shows on my favorite decades, the 70s, 80s, even the 60s, but he takes a deep dive in all of the great grindhouse slasher movies, all movies that kind of fit into the exploitation world. He does extensive coverage on a lot of European directors, and especially the Italian directors, which I feel is, not given the attention it should be. Like recently, I just watched a video of a guy I just discovered who's got a good show, and he talked about the top. He had these two big lists: the top 70s and the top movies from the 80s, the top slasher films of all time. Very cool list. There was quite a few movies in both of the lists that I have not seen, so that was cool. But the one thing I will say, it was I guess to a degree, a big criticism of mine was that there was no Italian directors mentioned. There was no Lucio Fulci, or I think Dario Argento. Suspiria was in one of the lists, but I kind of feel like he kind of glazed over a bunch of movies that he could have easily talked about, and especially in the world of Italian cinema. I mean, that stuff is, just incredible. So that part of it was kind of disappointing, but otherwise it was very good. And so, one other thing that I thought was kind of interesting. One other guy that I really like, he did a recent coverage, a series of videos of his top slasher movies, and he had said that originally he was going to pick Halloween as being his favorite, But he said that he has a lot of mixed things about the franchise as a whole. He's not a fan of a lot of the movies that have come out since then, and he felt that the fan base for Halloween is they're kind of I don't know how else to describe it. Well, more or less, he kind of felt that they're a bunch of like assholes in a way. Like they're very territorial and they shit on a lot of movies and they get in, you know, they're all a bunch of trolls and they go after people. You know, it is what it is. I don't really believe that. And I kind of agree with his stance on, he felt that some of the other movies in the franchise are so bad that it kind of, diminishes the quality of how he views the original. And I get that. Like an example for me would be the Matrix films. I think the Matrix, the first one, is, just, a masterpiece and arguably the best, action movie ever made. And, I have, not, I have kind of disregard and I'm not a fan in any way, shape, or form of the other two movies. And I initially I felt like it did diminish the quality of the first one because they were so bad. But at the end of the day, I look at each movie, even if it's in a franchise, I look at each movie at kind of face value if it stands on its own. And at the end of the day, those movies, as bad as they are, I still feel The Matrix is still, kind of on this affix level. I still regard it just as high as when I first saw it. So, it doesn't. To me, it's like a good movie's a good movie, and whether there's, you know, attention drawn to it or there's it becomes a part of this massive franchise and becomes this really big mass marketed kind of thing. you know a movie is going to stand the test of time. It's going to find that audience. People are going to find that interesting, or they're going to always come back to it, and it's going to be something that's going to be unspoken. And so for me, Halloween doesn't lose any. There are quite a few films in the franchise I actually do like a lot, and I'll be getting into that in future shows. But I still think it's an amazing film. And the funny thing is like again, this came out in '78. I saw this film probably for the first time when I was like 9 or 10 years old, and it always scared the hell out of me. It was one of the first slasher movies I ever saw. And it's still, I think it still holds up. And as many times I have multiple copies of Halloween, and I have 3 or 4 different versions of it on DVD. I have it on VHS. I've seen it an ungodly amount of times, like most people out there. And the coolest thing I ever experienced around Halloween was about 8 to 10 years ago. They had a special screening of Halloween at the Strand uh, movie theater in Rockland, Maine, which is a really beautiful movie theater. And it was on Halloween. It was like the week of Halloween, and they showed the original Halloween, but they had the original negative, and it was the film, and it was amazing. By even by during that time, I had seen the movie a bazillion times, and watching it on the big screen with an amazing sound system, the whole thing, and seeing it on film, it literally was like watching it for the first time. There were all of these things, especially visually, that I never noticed before, and it was just incredible. So I've seen it in in its absolute glory as far as the quality, and it was amazing. It was one of the best movies. That was one of the best movie going experiences I've ever had. Was seeing Halloween on the big screen, but with the original film. Like, it was just amazing. And but that being said, as much as I love Blu-rays, and I am a hardcore fan, and I always talk about the superiority, and now I'm starting to understand how glorious 4K is. I have never seen Halloween on Blu-ray, which is like kind of fucked up and kind of weird. And I've never owned. I've don't I've never owned it. I don't have it on Blu-ray, and it's been available for years on Blu-ray. And I've seen throughout the years, and especially the last 5 years or so, when I became a really big kind of, well, if you want to say it, but kind of sewer of Blu-rays, where I was really, I jumped full throttle into buying Blu-rays and come across all kinds of editions on Blu-ray of Halloween on Blu-ray. But for some reason, I wanted to try to hold out and get like the definitive version of the movie and a really great quality version of the movie. And and in my travels, to be honest, I felt like I never really came across it. And I know there's like most of the versions that I was coming across for Halloween were kind of like the standard Blu-ray versions, which are really good. But I was waiting for something with, like a collector's edition or just something that had something different, like a higher end quality Blu-ray. And I got sidetracked with buying all these other movies that I buy and blah blah blah. And and finally, I was at Bull Moose the other day, like I said on Saturday, and I finally bit the bullet, and I bought it. And this edition, this is the special 35th 35th year anniversary edition, and it's amazing. It was so worth the wait. It comes with this beautiful package, beautiful little booklet here, beautiful artwork. There's a whole like all of these great photos, whole big in-depth story about the film. Really great, really beautiful little package. And I have to say, the Blu-ray edition of this movie is completely astounding. I mean, it's amazing. It is simply amazing. And again, it's one of those experiences where I've seen this movie so many times I can't count. I couldn't possibly count how many times I've seen this movie. Um, it literally was like watching it for the first time. Probably for me being such a huge fan of this movie and knowing this movie like the back of my hand, I, even like in comparison to seeing it on the big screen, which is probably, you know, the greatest experience, but I almost feel like this seeing it on Blu-ray and getting just an incredible edition of this movie was is almost better than was almost better than that experience, or just as good. The sound, I mean, the iconic soundtrack, of course, by composed by John Carpenter. It's all remixed on Blu-ray, and it's just unbelievable. Full surround sound. The picture, the quality is unbelievable, unbelievable. There are certain scenes in this film, especially just even scenes alone where you're seeing the town of Haddonfield. It is just pristine, and you can see all so much detail, and the colors pop. Just incredible, just incredible. The mix, the way this was mixed, especially the sound design and the music, the way this was mixed and transferred to this edition of Blu-ray, that to me is the highlight. Like, it's really unbelievable. Like, it's totally immersive. I have a pretty good sound system here, so you feel like you're the co-pilot in the middle of this universe, and it's just incredible. And there's actually some really cool special features. There's a really long documentary about Jamie Lee Curtis and her, basically kind of acknowledging after so many years. She for a long time, she kind of became one of the known as a scream queen. After Halloween, she had a pretty big lull in her career, but then she started getting all of these movie offers and went on to, do lots of uh, awesome slasher movies. Probably one of the best is Prom Night. Really awesome slasher movie. She did a whole slew of slasher movies, And then her career really, really exploded, and she became a household name, or she's, one of the biggest stars in all of Hollywood. And she went on to do action movies and comedies, and True Lies of Arnold Schwarzenegger, of course, and then A Fish Called Wanda. I mean, she was just recently in Knives Out, which is just amazing. Probably one of her greatest roles. She's an amazing actress, and she's really versatile. And she, obviously starred in The Fog, also by John Carpenter, and has, had this long working relationship with John Carpenter. But there's a cool, interesting documentary on here where she basically, for a long time, she's always talked about how she's not a fan of horror films, and she kind of distanced herself from horror. And then years and years later, she decided to embrace it. And the documentary is about kind of her embracing that side of her life and the fans that were so enamored with her as a scream queen. And it's about her kind of accepting that, and her going to all of these conventions and seeing how massive her fan base really was, and then also how massive the love of Halloween was, and just it's kind of interesting, and it's her like going to these conventions and having this you know uh, revelation about that and those experiences. The coolest thing about this movie, and it's the coolest part of this Blu-ray, but then it's also kind of disappointing. But there there has always been there's two versions of Halloween, and there's the theatrical version, which is amazing and terrific. That was released in the theater, and then that version went to DVD and Blu-ray, VHS, and 4K. But there was also a made-for-TV version where basically there was about more or less 15 to 20 minutes of added of footage that was taken out of the theatrical version, and it was put into the TV version, and it was on. I remember as a kid seeing. First, I saw the theatrical version, this version, and then I remember it was Halloween was in syndication for a while on television, and and both versions were quite a bit different in a lot of ways. And I remember always loving that footage, the TV version, because story wise, there's certain things about it that are very different, and I've never been able to find that. I've never been able to find, say, the TV version, or even finding those scenes. And on this Blu-ray, there is all of that footage from the TV version. The only thing that's disappointing, it would have been cool to have the actual TV version where that footage is in the movie, but it's still amazing to have because I never hear anybody talk about the TV version, and obviously it's different, but I kind of wish that they had kept those scenes in the theatrical version. It's really cool. The reason that I think it's so that those scenes that were cut out, why they're so good, is because there's all of these scenes of where Dr. Loomis, played by Donald Pleasance, who is the psychiatrist, in charge of Michael Myers' case. There's all of these scenes where he's at the hospital and he is basically pleading with the other doctors and pleading with the board to, really bring in reinforcements about, with security around Michael Myers, and trying to really say that and get his point across that he feels that he is a monster, and he is, destined for really horrible things, and nobody listens to him. And he really lays out this big case as to why he feels that, this has to be given the biggest focus, and that he is, on the verge of some awful, awful things, and that he's way more dangerous than people were thinking he actually was. And in this footage, there's this whole big scene of where Donald Pleasance, Dr. Loomis, is pleading with the doctors and lays out this whole case. And it's super interesting. It's a really amazing scene. A great dialogue between him and two of the other doctors who were like kind of running the hospital. And there's also a scene of where he's in the room with Michael Myers and he's a kid where he's talking with him. And Michael Myers is silent the whole time, but it's really great and it's really riveting. And it's interesting because it really goes into you get a sense of how dangerous Michael Myers actually is. And in the theatrical version, there all of that stuff is left out, and it's still great, obviously, but and you still get a sense of what's going on. But it's I think those scenes were should have been kept in the theatrical release because it does give you they're great scenes, great acting scenes, and great dialogue, and it does give you enough backstory without it being too much. And I think it's I think it makes for a better experience. So, and again, it would have been cool to have two versions of the film where you could see that footage that like they could have say the TV version with this, added footage and then just have the theatrical version and you can watch both. Maybe it exists somewhere. I haven't seen it, but that would be cool. But that being said, it's still pretty awesome that you can see this footage and that it's it's got you know it's really good quality and that it's still part of the movie's history. And it's funny because Halloween is obviously, like I said, one of those movies where you're like, well, what else can you add to the conversation, or what else could I add to the conversation? Because this movie is already, looked at as a iconic movie, and rightfully so. And all of the, you know, how much it did for the genre of the slasher movie world, how influential it was. But I never hear it talked about. I never hear that part of it talked about as far as that there's actually two versions of the film, the TV version and the theatrical version. And I never hear anybody ever talk about the theatrical. I mean the TV version, and the fact that there's actually quite a quite a bit of footage that was cut out. Like 10 or 15 minutes, and so it's like significant. I see that two other movies that I think about that I feel like there's a lot of similarities, and I prefer them the most. But Ridley Scott's Alien, of course, the masterpiece that that film is. There's the theatrical version of that film, and then there's the director's cut. And the director's cut has about ten minutes of scenes that were cut out. And whenever I watch that movie, I always watch the director's cut because that footage is so terrifying, and it just gives you enough backstory and an extra element of of fear, and it's just amazing. And I don't know why they cut it out. I think it's because they cut it out because of the length. I think that's why, and that's probably why. I don't know why that happened to John Carpenter's film, but whenever I watch Ridley Scott's Alien from '79, I always watch the director's cut with that bonus footage because I think at the end of the day it's just better. There's a couple of other examples of that. There's also the sequel Aliens, which is probably the greatest sequel ever made. Uh, James Cameron's Aliens. There's two versions of that. There's the theatrical version, which is again a masterpiece, but there's also a director's cut where there's another version of that film where there's 10 minutes of extra footage. where it goes more into the life of the colonists and their first kind of interaction with the xenomorph, and you get a sense of what life was like for these colonists, and it's amazing. It's amazing. Again, the same thing. When I watch Aliens, I always watch that version. I prefer that version as great and as amazing as the theatrical version is. The uh, the extended cut, the director's cut, I think is superior because it's even more haunting and terrifying. And it's, significant because again, it's 10 to 15 minutes longer than the theatrical version. And I think that was probably handled the same way. The studio probably decided that, or, James Cameron decided it's maybe a little too long, so they cut it out. But I think it's superior. Another movie I think where it's superior as far as the footage that was cut out, The Exorcist. There's a theatrical version and a director's cut. The same exact example, same exact case. Whenever I watched The Exorcist, I only watched the director's cut, and again, it's like 10 or 15 minutes longer. But the footage that was cut out is just incredible. So I feel the same way with Halloween and the TV version, which is kind of funny that there's a TV version. But I'm not aware, and I have never come across it, that there's an actual version of the an actual TV version out there on Blu-ray that you can watch, which would be so cool and amazing. If anybody knows of anybody who's going to watch this video knows of that, um, yeah, let me know. But that all being said, you know, I am super excited that I finally bought this on Blu-ray. One, obviously one of the greatest slasher movies of all time. One of the biggest things for this film, obviously, some people look at this as being, or look at this film to a degree as being like the greatest slasher film of all time, and where the most influential, or that this movie kicked off the world of slasher films. And I don't think that, well, that's not true. There were plenty of movies that came before this that were also slasher movies that were very, very influential on this movie. But that being said, this movie is still just amazing, amazing. This movie was very much inspired by Black Christmas, which predated the Canadian slasher classic, which predated this movie by quite a few years. And John Carpenter has said that how influential that is was how influential Black Christmas was on this movie. And but still on its own, it's quite a bit different than Black Christmas, I think. But it's obviously, it was really influenced by that movie. But it doesn't, you know, undermine or take away the magic of this film. Like, it's just amazing. And the other thing that historically, like, this was the first independent film that became a blockbuster. More, and that's a definite first. It was a definite first in that regard. It was the first, like, low budget slasher movie that went on to make, millions and millions of dollars at the box office, and it was picked up by a massive company, and it really put the slasher film genre on the in the view of the American public. And it, in that regard, it changed horror history forever. And I think to a degree it gave it, outside of just it being an underground art form or style of filmmaking, it really gave it, if you look at by industry standards, it gave it real traction. And that it was a legitimate style of filmmaking. So, so many great things about this movie. But I'm super excited I finally bought this on Blu ray. So definitely check this out if you can. Just an amazing movie. So thanks again. This is Jason Dean, and we will see you next time. Peace.